right? Specifically tonight, what we're trying to think about is the way that certain benefits have been bestowed on some at the expense of others according to this thing called race, and how this disparity has had and continues to have very devastating, dramatic effects on us, right? On our health, as Dr. Hardy was pointing out, right? That would be physical health, also mental health, on individual health, as well as collective health, on society, right? So we're thinking about identity politics, education, we're thinking about religion, healthcare, and also on the economy. So where you can live, where you can work, right? What resources you have access to. So the humanities then helps us to think about all these things. But it also gives us the opportunity to see beyond just these disparities and these different elements as individual. It gives us an opportunity to think about them as collective, and also to think about them not as natural or essential or God ordained necessarily, but as socially constructed, right? So as much as we may have been taught to think about race, like gender, as something that is biological, that inheres in us, that it's essential, what the humanities shows us is that race is socially constructed, which means that it's a category of categories, right? That's actually created from superficial or perceived differences, and not out of and also, excuse me, so from these superficial differences, and also out of our desire, we create these categories out of our desire to try to understand this very confusing and complex world in which. So rather than being static, then the notion of race, who was white or black, et cetera, it actually evolved over time, right? And discussions of these sorts of physical differences, and I'll speak to history for a moment, right? Some would say it began in the 4th century, like around Aristotle's time, but it really ramped up, right? It got way more vigorous around the 18th century. And the reason was, right, because we have, right, I mean, what's happening is in the 18th century, right, we're having this greater political and economic impetus to support the colonial, right, endeavor, as well as enslavement. So then what does it do then to say that race is biological, fixed, rather than sociological, fluid, is that it's a way of proving that the white race was superior to all other races, and that there was not an ideological, but a biological justification for colonization as slavery as an economic system. And even the Bible, right, which many of us here cherish and love, was deployed for these purposes, right? So as much as it was deployed for emancipation, it was also deployed in order to enslave, dehumanize, and even to justify racism, like the Curse of Ham, other passages on enslavement. So this guy, Linnaeus, in the 18th century, creates this taxonomy of races in which he determines that white is superior and everybody else falls somewhere below. And this and other things that happen historically, right, lead to the reification of this category of race and also white supremacy, right? The thinking that white people are above everyone else. So over time, what happens then, right, is that this ideology or this framework that rationalizes a racial hierarchy as the product of natural order, that it's, like I said, divine or God ordained, it was instituted and it was institutionalized. And so because it was ubiquitous, and it was so far reaching, every one of us, no matter how woke we think we are, has been socialized to interpret the world through this framework. We say then that racism, and my colleagues have already spoken to this a little bit, we say that racism is systemic rather than simply individual, because it was built into the structure of society over thousands of years. And it cannot just all of a sudden be done because slavery was abolished or we had a black president in office. I want you to think about it, right? So say you have this bad habit you really want to break, right? What do the experts say? It takes what, like 30 days? If you're really intentional and you're right. For me, it's more like it's been years, but anyhow, but think about if you got a destructive habit, right? And not just an individual habit, but we're talking about a habit that is a collective habit, maybe even a global, right, through colonization and imperialism, a global habit that we need to break, that is destructive because people are being dehumanized, they are being killed. Humans are being destroyed over this. So here's the thing, right? How long does it take? Hundreds of years? The thing is, maybe it takes hundreds of years, but That's if every single person is committed to breaking this destructive habit. The problem, as I see it, is that unfortunately we can't all get on the same page because some folks are still benefiting from this destructive habit, right? I want to speak a little bit more to racism as systemic, and then we'll talk a little bit about white supremacy and then our responsibility as white people, right? So the point about racism that I really want to sort of hammer home, and I think especially in light of Eric Garner's words specifically, is that racism is in the air that we breathe. Black and brown people have been exploited and murdered with impunity for hundreds, thousands of years as a result of imperialism and colonization. This continues to happen because it appears that we have made some strides, because people of color don't have it as bad as they used to. For hundreds of years, Black and brown people were enslaved, and yes, they were emancipated physically, but Jim Crow was then instituted so that would prevent lest Black people think that there's a possibility that they could have been emancipated mentally and were equal to white people. See, the issue is that this is continuing to happen now, right? Strategically, systemically, institutionally, Black and brown people are being oppressed and excluded from citizenship, personhood, government, adequate healthcare, education, just to name a few, right? We've already talked about racial profiling on job applications, law enforcement. So when Eric Garner cries out, "I can't breathe," it's an individual literal statement because he's literally being choked, right? But I want us also to think about this as being a figurative and collective statement. That the words that he uttered are a collective cry because he and all Black and brown people are choking in this air, which is why, for those of you who've also been attending protests, right, wearing a mask, right, when folks wear masks that actually say, "I can't breathe," it's a profound symbol, right? It's a message about this racist system that has implicitly and explicitly benefited white people to the detriment and dehumanization of Black and brown people. It's hard to breathe in a society where you're viewed, even if unconsciously, as other than white, which is the norm, and therefore less than. It's also hard to breathe when you lack the social and institutional power to affect change in the world. None of us can argue that whites have held institutional power and legal authority for thousands of years. And this is actually white supremacy, right? And I know those of us that are white kind of, sometimes we cringe when we hear this, but right, I mean, Dr. Beatty was speaking to this, right? What we're seeing right now is it's exacerbated, right? But this socio-political economic system of domination that's based on racial categories that benefits those defined as white or perceived as white. And Dr. Hardy actually went through some numbers, but I just want to say, right, U.S. Congress, 90% white. U.S. governors, 96% white. Top military advisors, 100% white. President and vice president, as we know, 100% white. People in charge of media. Okay, so this is what we watch on TV and the news, what we read, the music that we listen to, the people who are in charge of media, 90% white. Teachers, over 80% white, and full-time college professors, over 80% white. So while this is a gradual shift is occurring, certain mindsets still prevail, specifically the understanding of whiteness, right? And what we have to start to understand, right, or sorry, specifically mindsets around white supremacy and white privilege. So what we have to understand, right, is that whiteness then is a privileged identity, and it's also a vested interest. And Robin DiAngelo writes about this, but also I'm specifically thinking about Cheryl Harris's work too, right? So if someone's perceived as white, they're able to access certain privileges, right? And some of those, as Dr. Hardy was talking to, they're actually like just privileges of the mind and that offer us peace of mind, right? Like self-worth, representation, visibility, positive expectations. You know, I can go on and on, but I remember years ago when sort of the doors blew open for me, and I really started to understand what whiteness was and white privilege. And I read this article by Peggy McIntosh, and she talks about white privilege as an invisible. I see Dr. Canada's. There's an invisible package of unearned assets I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. It's like a backpack of tools that you get simply because you're white. And I know this can be a particularly hard pill to swallow for us white folks, right? I mean, we may not feel privileged, especially those of us, right, who feel that we've been disadvantaged in other ways. And I talk and wrestle through this with my students all the time, right? Especially like class and economic disparities, right? Some of my students really don't feel that they experience any privilege, right? Working at minimum wage or below it, also right now, especially being unemployed, this automatically discounts you from certain privileges in the world. And no doubt, seriously can affect your mental health and well-being, not to mention your capacity for upward mobility. But when we look to history, we actually see that class disparity as well has disproportionately fallen along racial lines. And this began, I believe, right, historically with white plantation owners' justification of slavery as a social system. So they elevated the poor whites above the black enslaved laborers. But that's a whole nother conversation. But so us white folks, we get sensitive and defensive talking about this, right? And D'Angelo calls this white fragility. But I want us to think about right now, right? How do we feel when we talk about this stuff? And for some of you who are my white friends out there, you may have been involved in all these awesome conversations all summer, and you've been reading your books, how to be an anti-racist and everything. So you may have become more comfortable. But the reality is, right, it's hard for us. And the reason that it feels so uncomfortable and sometimes you get a little squeamish, right, is because it's because it's not normal for us to talk about this, right? The feelings that we're having are normal because it isn't normal for us to talk about or even think about race or our whiteness. I mean, we live in a society where we've been systematically and strategically sheltered from having to think about race or to do this kind of work, right? And what I want us to think about is the way in which whiteness has been normalized. And I just want to use some examples, and I'm going to try to make this quick. I don't want to go too much longer, but I do have a few important things that I'd like to share with you. So this really quick. So some examples, right, that I use with my students to think about this are, so one of them is stick figures, right? Stick figures we usually draw, right? We assume that they're white unless you do what? You actually color in the face, right? So there's an assumption. Okay, that may not, okay, that's fine, Rawson, but go a little deeper. Okay, what about Barbie, right? 1959, she was white until 1980 when we saw the first Black Barbie, right? So that's 21 years. Speaking of the 1980s, that's when the first makeup, right, was created for darker skinned people. And I won't say just women because, I want to include the diversity of experiences and everybody can wear makeup. But anyway, the point is, though, everybody should be able to wear makeup, and Black women couldn't, or men or whoever couldn't until 1980, right? Because there simply was nothing made for them, right? And cosmetics have been, makeup has been throughout the 20th century was being produced. But finally, Band-Aids, right? Which many of you may have already thought about, but this always, my students kind of eyes pop open when they think about this, because many of them haven't, especially if they're white, right? Band-Aids for almost a century were created only pink, right? And so it was only, and I mean, it was only like, I don't know how many years ago that darker skin Band-Aids were created. And what's interesting is that they were marketed, Band-Aids were marketed, the pink Band-Aids were marketed as flesh colored. But the only flesh that's colored sort of pink is white flesh, right? So we're taught implicitly and explicitly that whiteness is the norm, right? It's the universal and not a racial identity. It's been synonymous with human, as Dr. Eddie pointed out, with American as well, seen as a default, and anything outside of it is racialized. So as a result, those of us who are white were never actually taught to see ourselves as a community or a collective. I'm thinking also here with you, Dr. Hardy, and some of the things that you were saying about collective thinking and understanding. But we weren't taught to think about how we're all affected. We're all affected if the system is broken, right? Often, white people have the privilege of seeing ourselves as individuals with individual freedoms. And then we also think that racism inheres in individual acts. But it's not just, as we've talked about, individual present in individual microaggressions, right? It's in these invisible systems that confer unsought racial dominance. So we're white, right? If you're white, you got this backpack, you can't do anything about that, right? You got the backpack, but the question is now, what can you do, right? What can we do to help? And that's the thing is I think the challenge here is for me to you and from me to myself, right? Is what are we doing in the effort toward equity and racial justice, right? I mean, if you think about it, when women wanted the vote, right? They needed men. They absolutely needed men. They couldn't grant suffrage to themselves. Men had to act because they had institutional power and legal authority. In the same way, I believe that real change is contingent upon white people waking up, recognizing our role in this, and acting, right? And I just a couple more things, and then I'm done. I promise you guys. But the protests that have erupted all across our country during the pandemic were a collective outcry for racial justice. People wanting to be seen, Black people and also brown people wanting to be seen and valued as equally human and worthy of life. So not only do I protest and speak out against racism personally and anti-Black sentiments because I'm a student and professor of the humanities, but I've come to acknowledge that as a white person, I've benefited from a system that inherently privileges white people while disproportionately disadvantaging and even dehumanizing Black and brown people. So maybe the most important thing that the humanities can encourage us to do is not just to think about these things, but actually to see and to honor our common humanity, right? If an individual or a collective group of people are crying out for justice, right, it deserves our attention. It demands, I believe, that we listen and educate ourselves. Audre Lorde, the great Audre Lorde, wrote, and I believe that this is something I just want us to sort of like chew on this, because it speaks to the kind of exhaustion that I believe Black and brown people are experiencing right now in trying to get us white people to understand. She writes, traditionally in American society, it's the members of the oppressed, objectified groups who are expected to stretch out and bridge the gap between the actualities of our lives and the consciousness of our oppressor. For in order to survive, those of us for whom oppression is as American as apple pie have always had to be watchers, to become familiar with the language and manners of the oppressor, double consciousness that Wall talks about, even sometimes adopting them for some illusion of protection. Whenever the need for some pretenses of communication arises, those who profit from our oppression call upon us to share with them. In other words, it is the responsibility of the oppressed to teach the oppressors their mistakes. And she goes on to say, I'm responsible for educating teachers who dismiss my children's culture in school. Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. Lesbians and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual world. The oppressors then maintain their position and evade responsibility for their own actions. There is a constant drain of energy, trauma. There is a constant drain of energy which might better be used in redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future. There's one last thing I want to say. Although we could all, I mean, after Audre Lorde speaks, it's like, right? There's one last thing I want to say, and this is to you, white folks. I came up with this acrostic, right? And I want to share it with you just before I go. So it's brave, right? Because I think we need to be real brave right now, like real brave, and go into these conversations and just do it, you know? So the B is to be humble. You are absolutely going to mess up. I do all the time. Be ready for it and accept it. You know what I mean? Apologize, don't defend, go with it. R is recognize. We exist. We all exist in a racist society. We do. And it confers often unsought dominance, racial dominance, right, on white people. So let's reflect on our complicity in the ways that we've benefited. So the A, so be humble, recognize and reflect. A, acknowledge and accept. Acknowledge that racism is an everyday reality for Black and brown people, right? This is what they live every day. And we as white people have the choice to look away and walk away, right? So that choice in and of itself is a privilege. So we need to, I would encourage you to accept then our responsibility. Value and validate are the V's. Value and validate Black and brown lived experience, right? Racism and microaggressions as a result of racist ideology are something we will never be able to understand ever in our body. We will never know. We will never know that the pain and the trauma that is associated with that. And so the best thing that we can do then is to listen, to hear, to see, to honor, respect, to learn. And that leads me to the E, educate yourself. Find resources, learn as much as you can. The fire didn't start in a vacuum. It was fueled by history. And the fact that we've not learned and changed our behavior means that it will continue to rage unless we fight it together.